Welcome. I'm just going to give us 1 minute so that anyone who wants to join us can, and then we'll get started. So give me just 1 minute. Hi, everybody. We'll get started in about 30 seconds. I'm just making sure that I give everybody a chance to join us who wants to, and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and begin. I am Dawn Knight. I am an English teacher from Westfield, Indiana, just north of Indianapolis, and I'll be going through our lesson today with you. So we're going to start with a review of Friday's AP exam practice. Don't worry if you didn't see the lesson Friday. This warm-up will still be valuable, and it'll help with today's exam practice as well. So first, let's read the assignment together to catch you up if you weren't here Friday. Below is an argument prompt. Read and analyze it. Write down your thesis and reasons for stance. Delve deeper. Think about the multiple perspectives as you determine your reasons. Then write down potential counter-arguments. So here's the prompt. One of the first-year student orientation initiatives at a local university is to collect incoming students' cell phones and keep them for 48 hours. The purpose of the initiative is to give students an opportunity to integrate into their new school culture and make friends on campus. Carefully consider the effects of this initiative and the extent to which they might support, complicate, or contradict its intended goals. Use appropriate specific evidence to illustrate and develop your position on the advisability of the 48-hour cell phone ban. Okay, now let's take a look. Since I can't see your answers, I'll show you just a couple that you can use to do a self-assessment. Although they're not perfect, the top two go beyond the black and white pro or con argument here. They both consider the gray areas, the other perspectives and tensions in the prompt. So let's take a look at those. Despite good intentions to help students integrate into their new college environment, a ban on cell phones would likely cause anxiety and safety issues, making a 48-hour ban a misguided approach to the problem. Or, because students who have a support group in college are more likely to graduate, a 48-hour ban on cell phones upon arrival to campus is worth the initial anxiety and inconvenience it may cause. Sorry about the typo there. Now let's look at a couple that don't work as well. Colleges should implement a 48-hour ban to give students an opportunity to integrate into their new environment. Or colleges should not implement the ban. So the bottom two are just kind of the pro-con. The top two include those multiple perspectives and kind of show the different voices in this conversation. So if you'd like, you can pause here and just do a quick self-assessment based on the examples to see if you feel like there are any improvements you can make or what you did well. So you can just freeze the screen and take as much time as you need with that, and we'll go ahead and move on. I also chose one of the stances here in order to look at the reasons and counter arguments that were also part of this assignment. So if you look at the reasons for the stance is because students who have a support group in college are more likely to graduate, a 48-hour ban on cell phones upon arrival to campus is worth the initial anxiety and inconvenience it may cause. So some reasons for that might be to give students time to acclimate, to give students an impetus to make new friends, and students are forced out of their comfort zone, which leads to personal growth. But I also want to anticipate what the potential counter arguments are. So it could be that this is a safety issue. It could cause unnecessary stress and anxiety during a time that's already pretty stressful. Okay, so The idea of looking at multiple perspectives here gives credibility to our arguments. It strengthens the argument when we anticipate the other side, and especially if we can refute that with evidence. And again, if you want to pause and just take a look at your reasons and counter arguments and do a quick self-assessment. Okay, now we're going to move on to today's lesson. Let's look at what we need to know. So if you look at the top, we have the essential knowledge pieces of the lesson here. These are lessons you can apply in other high school classes, in college, and beyond. We've been working on the top one. The effectively entering into an ongoing conversation about a subject means engaging the positions that have already been considered and argued about. In fact, we just kind of talked about that. And we've been doing that throughout the Unit 9 lessons, looking into the complexities of the issue by looking into the various voices of it or the shades of gray. Today, we're going to do a little of the second one. Evidence and sources will either support, complement, or contradict a writer's thesis as it pertains to the introduction, but we'll get into it in even more depth in tomorrow's lesson, our last lesson in this argument, Unit 9. So these are important again because demonstrating the complexity of an issue rather than just seeing it in black and white or pro and con shows sophistication and gives you credibility. Also, it gives you a voice in important conversations going on in the world, and yours will be an important one because it will have come from analyzing the multiple perspectives and fully understanding the issue rather than just sharing a meme or believing the way everybody else you know believes. It'll be more informed and therefore more powerful. Okay, we're adding in another rubric row today, row A, and although we've written a couple of thesis statements, we're going to work on them with a little more intention today. So look at the right side. You're awarded the point for this row if you respond to the prompt with a thesis that presents a defensible position. And then look at the scoring notes I circled in orange. What that means is that rather than just restating the prompt, you take a clear position, not just stating that there are pros and cons. But we're also still working on row C, sophistication, and you're awarded a point in this row if there is sophistication of thought or complex understanding as part of the argument. Responses that earn this point explore the complexity and tensions and articulate the limitations and implications by situating it within a broader context. So we've been talking about that throughout Unit 9, but today we're going to look at how it pertains to the introduction. And although I use the argument rubrics here, just a reminder that this also applies to the synthesis essay. Okay, so here's what we're doing today. We're looking at what belongs in an introduction, how to write a more sophisticated thesis statement, and how to write a more sophisticated introduction. So remember that we're more credible when we illustrate that we have looked at an issue thoroughly. It means we're informed and came to a stance from a place of education, not bias. This can begin to happen as early as the introduction, which is our focus for today. So here are some of the main elements that belong in an introduction. And we'll talk about each of these in more depth as we move through this lesson. So you should have an attention getter or hook, something that draws your audience in. You should look at context and background information, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those mean. And then you should have a thesis statement where you take your stance on the issue. So let's look at attention getter or hook first. You don't want to spend a ton of time with this in a timed essay situation because you only have so much time and this isn't where most of your points are going to be coming from. And you typically want to avoid very general rhetorical questions. Instead, think about maybe including a specific fact or anecdote that illustrates the importance of the issue or makes it relevant to the audience. You want to avoid cliches here, those kind of trite quotes like you might see on the wall of a classroom or on a magnet, something like a time heals all wounds is a little cliche. So instead, something more sophisticated, like I said, an anecdote or a fact or a statistic or something that makes the reader see that it's important or that makes it relevant to them. let's look at context. So the context gives the reader essential information about the issue and the various voices that are already included in the conversation that's been going on about the issue. So in other words, what are those different perspectives and their stances? Remember, this is part of the sophistication, so it shows you understand the complexity of the issue when you bring that into your introduction. It gives the reader essential information, essentially. Okay, background information is similar, and a lot of times in an introduction, we'll see those two things kind of interwoven, but and sometimes even in one sentence, um, because looking at those various perspectives is also part of the background. However, it's also about making sure that you give the reader any necessary information to understand the issue. Maybe it's a concept they haven't heard of that's difficult to understand, or they need a summary. Um, what something is or what it means before you can actually start convincing them of your position. And then finally, we get to the thesis statement. And I know we've talked about these off and on, and you've written a couple of thesis statements, but just some important details to remember. Your introduction should end with the thesis statement. And let's look at some of the things. You want it to be the focus of your essay. It should answer the prompt. It should go beyond that mere there are pros and cons of the issue. Typically for an essay this length, it'll be 1 to 2 sentences. It's an assertion or your stance on the issue. And it's very important because this is how we focus your essay. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more in tomorrow's lesson, our last lesson, how that thesis is basically the building block of your entire essay. And it shouldn't be an announcement. You don't need a, I'm going to persuade you, or I am going to write about. You just want to state what the stance is. Now let's look at how all of these elements fit together. So if you remember last week, we had some little clips from essays or articles where we looked at limitations and implications, and one of them was about bats. So this is actually the introduction to that bat article. We're just going to read through it and look for those elements that we just talked about. So if you look at the top of the article here, the idea that bats could be responsible for the transmission of newly emerging and potentially deadly infectious diseases to humans began to take hold in 2002 with the discovery of a new coronavirus that caused severe respiratory infections called SARS. Okay, so that's a good hook, especially if you look at the fact that this was written in 2017 when they were going through a SARS episode. So then look at the background. Coronaviruses are widespread in animals from birds to whales and are the cause of common colds, but SARS was different, with the 2002 outbreak killing 800 people and generating frightening headlines worldwide. 3 years later, an article in Science titled "Bats Are Natural Reservoirs of SARS-like Viruses" announced the emerging scientific wisdom that bats were a global public health menace. Since that time, so-called virus hunters have pursued an intense international search for dangerous viruses in bats, and sensationalist media attention continues to accompany this search. Okay, so here's some background, what we need to know about bats and how they are related to SARS. And then some context. What are the current voices? Hordes of deadly diseases are lurking in bats and sometimes jumping to people. New Scientist reported in February 2014 asking, can we prevent a major pandemic? Several months later, Wired piled on with an article titled, Why Bats Are Such Good Hosts for Ebola and Other Deadly Diseases, which asserted that scientists are discovering new bat-borne viruses all the time. Such stories continue to this day. A February 2017 National Public Radio report called Why Killer Viruses Are on the Rise portrays bats as arguably one of the most dangerous animals in the world, and warns that when there are bats up in the sky, there could be Ebola in that poop that lands on your shoulder. Yet, once one delves into the world of bats and infectious diseases, these stories begin to fall apart. A closer look at what science knows about bats strongly suggests that the scientific and media furor is at best overstated and is likely a distraction from more serious research and health problems. Above all, it turns out that while we certainly should be concerned about bats, we probably don't need to worry very much about what they might do to us. Okay, so those are some of those various perspectives. And you saw that within both of those, there were some perspectives in the background and a little bit of background in the context. And a lot of times, like I said, those are woven together. Also notice in that last paragraph, it starts with yet. And those little transition words we're going to talk about a little bit more tomorrow as well, but they add to that fluency, and that yet kind of showed us, hey, here's an alternative perspective that's coming, which is important to know. Okay, now the thesis. Rather, we should be worrying about what we are doing to bats in the name of science and public health. Okay, so this is this person's stance. And guys, I have no idea who's right. I'm just using this as an example of an intro. I would have to do way more research before I would know my stance on bats. Okay, so now let's try this with another of our topics from last week. If you remember our Should the US Colonize Mars? So first, let's look again at rubric row C. Remember, you want to get your reader interested, but it should also convey style and sophistication. So what would you do for an attention getter here? You might want to pause here and maybe think about what you would do. You can freeze the screen and take as long as you want with that, and we'll move on. So here's a potential example. Neil Armstrong's one small step inspired the nation and ushered in a golden age of scientific exploration in the United States. The discoveries that came out of this are still impacting lives more than 50 years later. Okay, so that's the good example. And look at the difference between that and would you like to go to Mars? Which is that very general rhetorical question at the beginning. Both of them have the intention of trying to get your audience involved, but the second one does a much better job of being sophisticated in doing that. This isn't the only way. You could use something about the environmental concerns like the wildfires in Australia here. There are a lot of different right ways to do this. Okay, now let's break down the rubric row again for background. So what background information might the reader need to know to understand the issue before you persuade them of your stance? Just take a minute to jot down some ideas. You don't have to write them out, maybe just a bullet pointed list. And then again, pause the feed if you want time to do that. And we'll go ahead and move on. So again, the top example here isn't enough. The US is thinking about colonizing Mars because of the environmental issues on Earth. Instead, let's look at some of the important background information, like why are they considering going to Mars? Why is this even a thing we're talking about? So some of those things that we might want to include here, the Earth's population is nearing 8 billion people. There's a strain on the environment and natural resources. The effects of global warming are only going to get worse. Colonizing Mars could be similar to the space race in which the US beat the Russians to the moon, leading to national pride and inspiring scientific discoveries. So those might all be things that we want to include as important elements of the background. All right, now let's do the same for context. What are some of those important voices in the issue saying? Again, jot down some of the ideas you have for context here. Pause the feed if you want to take some time and take as much time as you want to do that, and then you can press play and continue on with the lesson with us. So look at the top example here. Some people think the US should colonize Mars, others disagree. That's not really enough. It does show that there are pros and cons, the black and white of the situation, or the this is my side, that's their side. But it doesn't really illustrate the complexity of the situation or those shades of gray that we've been talking about. So instead, look at the examples below. Notice how using the fields and lenses that we talked about can help to get to some of those more complex perspectives. Within these different proponents and opponents, you can see environmental lens, scientific lens, economic, ethical, and so on. And so when we use those kind of lenses or fields to think about what are the important stakeholders in the conversation, we can get to a lot more depth than a simple pro-con. It gets us to that complexity. So look at some of the ideas under proponents. It could be the solution to the environmental issues on Earth. It could inspire national pride and scientific discovery. It is scientifically possible. But the opponents might point out that it could be expensive, that the time and money spent to colonize Mars could be invested in alleviating global warming's impacts on Earth. And they might find it ethically questionable since colonists wouldn't be able to return to Earth and their lifespan would be shorter because of the harsh environment. And look at the difference between that and just the simple pro-con. Okay, now the thesis. Um, So if you look at the rubric row here, responses that earn this point respond to the prompt rather than restating or rephrasing the prompt. And the thesis clearly takes a position rather than just stating that there are pros and cons. So responding to the prompt means you're engaging in the discussion. You've considered various perspectives and determined what your stance is from an informed place. And that should be reflected in your thesis. So you're not just restating the prompt, you're going beyond the mere yes or no. Instead, you want to reflect that careful consideration. So let's look at a couple of examples. If you've been doing the previous lessons, you may have already seen a couple of these. But before we look, take a minute to write your thesis, or maybe if you have some, you could revise them. And just pause the feed for a minute to do that if you want, and then we'll look at some examples in just a second. All right, so let's look at the examples here. The two on top again are a simple pro-con. So today I'm going to persuade you why the US should colonize Mars. That first one also announces which we want to avoid doing. The second one is the mere pro-con. The US should not colonize Mars. So instead, let's look at a couple of other options. The US should colonize Mars to provide new space for a growing population, to provide sanctuary from the environmental issues plaguing Earth, and to inspire the nation in the same way the race to the moon once did. Or, although there would be a renewed sense of national pride at being the first to colonize the red planet, the astronomical cost and ethical implications make it an unrealistic solution to Earth's environmental issues. Instead, that money should be invested into funding scientific research to find alternative sources of energy and lower the Earth's temperature, which would make colonizing Mars unnecessary. Okay, so you see the big difference. Now let's put this all together by looking at a complete introduction. So here's what it might look like. Neil Armstrong's one small step in 1969 inspired the nation and ushered in a golden age of scientific exploration in the United States. The discoveries that came out of this are still impacting lives more than 50 years later. In fact, with the Earth's population nearing 8 billion people and natural resources growing scarce, some are wondering whether another great space exploration, colonizing Mars, is the answer. It could, they believe, alleviate some of the pressure on Earth's natural resources. They also wonder whether it could save human existence if global warming makes that a necessity. Although there would be a renewed sense of national pride at being the first to colonize the red planet, the astronomical cost and ethical implications make it an unrealistic solution to Earth's environmental issues. Instead, that money should be invested into funding scientific research to find alternative sources of energy and lower the Earth's temperature, which would make colonizing Mars unnecessary. Okay, so notice this has all the elements we talked about. We have an attention getter with the Neil Armstrong one small step. But we didn't just put the quote, that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Instead, we wove it into a sentence there. We also have background and context information, why people are talking about this issue and what those various voices are. And then we finally have our stance, our thesis statement. All right, so here's what we did today. We looked at what belongs in an introduction. We looked at how to write a more sophisticated thesis statement and how to write a more sophisticated introduction. So let's look at your AP exam practice for tomorrow. All right, so we're using the prompt from Friday's lesson, and this time you're writing a complete introduction based on today's lesson. It should include an attention getter, background, context, and thesis statement. You can find a handout of this assignment in the link in the video description below. So you can find that. And we'll talk about this tomorrow in tomorrow's lesson. Tomorrow's our last lesson for Unit 9. And we're really going to put it all together with looking at how to set up an entire line of reasoning based on the thesis. Okay, thank you for watching. Remember to get outside, stay active, try to connect with somebody today, maybe phone or email or FaceTime, whatever it is. Please take care of yourselves, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks.